I don't know what you're talking about then, because I've just been out for a minute.
Oh, that's all right. So we've just had a question about why was it sort of impossible for ECan, for example, when I was on, to actually sort of do something about freshwater and make it better. So in my first term on ECan, it was kind of an interesting situation where it was half commissioners still. So this is like the national appointed commissioners, and then half of us were democratically elected. And at that point, it was simply we didn't have the numbers kind of situation. And that's, well, actually I was going to say that's democracy, but it wasn't actually democracy at that stage. It was sort of half democracy. But then the next term, which was my last term in this previous term, the reason it was really difficult to do anything overnight is because you're basically moving a whole system from what is currently legal to basically what is controlled or ultimately illegal. Now, ultimately, we want to make the protection of our environment the absolute focus of our legislation. So we want to build our economy and the way that these things work based on our environment being protected and ideally restored, because we're in such a state at the moment. So we as a council overnight didn't have the tools and the ability and the legislation to just say you can no longer act in this way, because unfortunately the way that the Resource Management Act worked is that there is a pretty strong and almost absolute protection of what's called existing rights. So if you have a consent to do something, it's really very difficult to stop that person from carrying out that activity for the life of that consent. Now, what is different now, and what our council did put in place, and hopefully, I don't know if you've got any comments for how this is progressing, Genevieve, but we put in place a $20 million and funded a $20 million program of work, which was a whole new system to redo our entire planning for Canterbury Waitaha under the new legislation. And this is the new legislation that the government brought in 2020. And the key difference with this legislation is that it now has Te Mana o Te Wai, or in other words, the health and well-being of the water, first in this legal hierarchy. So it's above all other needs, like even human drinking water, and definitely above economic needs. But this is like a whole community conversation. So there's a process up until the end of next year, the end of 2024, when regional councils across Aoteroa need to notify these new plans which actually implement Te Mana o Te Wai. And so the only way that we actually can understand and translate what Te Mana o Te Wai is in partnership with iwi mana whenua, and that's what actually dictates what that looks like for any one region, because it is going to be different for different regions. So that's what we put in place. So yes, it absolutely, looks like we're mucking around not doing anything, and I can totally understand that because I was there feeling like that's what was going on. But we were able to put in place this process that's going through the process now, and hopefully that results in real changes. But for a variety of reasons, which I won't go on about, it's kind of questionable whether the new, for example, RMA reforms are actually going to be delivering better outcomes for our environment. So thank you for that question. Anyone else who would like to go? Matt, do you want to, I can reach this to you.
Yeah, even if there's new regulations brought in by the government and councils are left to enforce them, it's not going to happen from what we've seen in the past, because there's no proactive or meaningful enforcement on the regulations we have now. How's the Green Party going to, or what's their policy on that, to either take the enforcement away from the councils on freshwater or environment, or force them somehow to actually enforce the regulations that are there, because I see it every day, regulations not enforced, you lay a complaint and basically you're laughed at. I've even had one council tell me, don't worry Matt, we got the farmer to send us some photos, it's not that bad. Yeah.
Okay, we go.
You start and then I'll.
Yeah, so I mean, for me, this is not Green Party policy. The Green Party policy is to affect an outcome that's going to lead to better freshwater situation, and that includes specific things like cutting synthetic nitrogen fertiliser and lowering stocking rates. The question of enforcement is a very important question, and we had a conversation with this down the line. I think there is a major problem that exists with the nature of the regional councils being heavily influenced by agricultural interests, particularly dairy interests, and so you get a double whammy of a reticence on the part of councillors to actually enforce existing consents, let alone refuse to even give their consents, because they are there and motivated by facilitating the interests of their industry. And then you have a problem of this kind of softly approach to regulatory action in the first place, let alone regulatory enforcement. And I think the critical problem we have at a political level is this this idea that's come out of neoliberalism, in fact, is that you shouldn't regulate or legislate, you should sort of go softly and let the market decide what happens. In fact, we need to be willing to be saying, hang on a minute, when you find out that lead in petrol is causing brain damage, or when you find out that asbestos is causing a very harmful form of cancer, you take regulatory legislative action and you prohibit it. And I think we need to have that attitude to both climate change but also to ecological protection. And then as to the question, which is that we should be proudly saying, as Eugenie Sage just did in the last press release responding to the National Party's agriculture policy, that we are not afraid of the need to regulate polluters to protect the greater good, to protect the community and protect our environment. The enforcement thing, the personal opinion I'll express here is that I think we do need to think about some way of having a national agency that can come and do consent enforcement, because it's very hard for those local employees of local councils to go and give stick to some farmer up the road when, I think you made this point, Matt, when their kid's going to be going to school with that kid's son the next day, and it's just difficult as part of our, it's difficult at a human level, but it's also difficult at a kind of a cultural level where people don't like to stick their head about the paragraph. Yeah. So the social difficulty of doing that, particularly in small regional areas. So I do think we need to think about it. I think the fisheries officer model is not a bad one. It's flawed, but it is a situation where they're a regulatory authority that can show up, and if they see you've got a fishing boat, you have to open your sacks and show them how many fish, what you've taken that day, and they act as a regulatory authority across the whole country. And I think we need to think about that sort of a system for that kind of enforcement. But the point is that there's an absolutely laissez-faire attitude to consents in the first instance. But then even what little and what few restrictions they do put in place, you're right, they're not enforced. And if people break the consents, they often get a reasonably weak enforcement. I'm sure there are instances, and you would have better knowledge of this than me, Lan, of where there has been effective enforcement of consents. But that's my thoughts on it and reflections on it, but I think the point is salient.
Only the very worst cases that get prosecuted.
Yeah.
Very, very tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, and it's a really high bar as well, because with past prosecutions, the councils know that they do need a really high body of evidence to actually successfully prosecute, and that is a really big hurdle as well. There are, especially on the compliance monitoring and enforcement, like a potential for another body who actually does it. There have been discussions about what role might Taumata Arawai do? So Taumata Arawai is this new regulator who is actually put in place to particularly regulate councils themselves, and this is usually in the avenue of like stormwater and wastewater discharges, but also drinking water protection and what that looks like. So Taumata Arawai have been sort of canvassed as a potential for this national body, and also the Ministry for the Environment. But I see like a lot of potential where that could go. I worry that with anything that sort of moves to a more centralised model, it actually risks just being totally ineffective, and that's kind of what we're seeing a little bit with this sort of great idea about the RMA reforms, but the actual connection to what's going on at place is very limited. And so we've just got to keep that in mind, but I agree it's something that we absolutely need to explore. Thank you for your question. Any other questions? Rosemary?
Carter, my question's about microplastics, which we haven't even mentioned. And when Kahu talked about how much of our bodies were water, I just sort of then thought, I wonder how much of our bodies are microplastics because of the water we've had. And so my question is a little bit to Kahu around that kind of work, but also, is anybody measuring in our drinking water how much microplastics there are?
Yeah, I love water. I feel like we all love water because we're drinking it all the time. We're in bodies of water. It's so cleansing. And like studies have recently come out saying that we are ingesting a credit card of plastics every week each. That is a lot of plastic. And so where does that come from? And when I think about these things, I think about like the whakapapa of our stuff and all the embodied energy that goes into the things that we have. So the first thing I think about when I think about microplastics is the fast fashion that was created by modern day, we've got modern day slavery to make these garments that are made from plastic. So from deep within the realms of rua moko, we're dredging out this oil, we're turning them into clothes, and then once those clothes are washed in our washing machines, they're turning into such small particles that they're just gone. We can't take them back, they're just out there. And so this, I get so passionate about it, and my mind goes in a million ways because these microplastics are such a huge issue, and every single day we're washing them into our drinking supplies. And yeah, it's about shifting not only our personal responsibility, but looking at those organisations who are making excess profits and just extracting and producing so much carbon. The embodied energy of the things that we have is massive. So I think from all of that kōrero, what I would say is something that we can hold on to that's really tangible is when we think about the whakapapa of our stuff. So that's the story of our stuff, the genealogy, where it's come from. So when I think about the clothes that I'm wearing, it's like, where did they come from? How much oil was used to produce them? Or do I know that it's organic cotton where the people were paid fair wages and it was made in New Zealand down the road? And I know the whakapapa of the things that I'm eating, that I'm wearing, and that I'm bringing into my life. So yeah, I think I'm going to hand over to Steve for the more like technical side of measuring microplastics and all those things. But yeah, if there was one thing I would want you to take away from my kōrero is to think about the whakapapa of our things, of all the things that we have, even of the systems of the things that we believe in, like where do they come from? Yeah, I'll leave you with that, and I'll hand over to Steve. Thank you.
I definitely can't do any better than that. In terms of measuring the microplastics, I can't actually answer that question, Rosemary. But
it's just a question, isn't it?
It's a good question. But I will say that tautoko what you're saying about the origin of plastics. I mean, we've got a very obvious solution to that as well, which is that Greenpeace has been running a campaign for a couple of years now to ban plastic beverage bottles. It's our major source of plastic product, or major use of plastics, single-use plastics that is. And it's actually something that's very doable, and most of the stuff that you buy in those single-use plastic containers are not things you need to buy at all. You'd probably be better off if you didn't buy them, such as fizzy beverages and beer. And so it's those are the sorts of things that we need to be looking at doing. But one other thing I want to acknowledge that I had an opportunity, I was very fortunate to get an opportunity to talk to Conrad Richter, who's a bowel cancer surgeon in Southland when I was down there. And I asked him about the extent of the impact of nitrate in terms of bowel cancer risk. And he said that's certainly the emerging evidence is there's an issue there. But he said the very understated issue here in New Zealand, the thing that people don't want to talk about, is the impact of alcohol consumption in terms of all sorts of cancers. We've known for some time that high red meat consumption is a risk for bowel cancer. And there's other known things, lack of exercise and hereditary history. But he himself said, and microplastics is an emerging risk. The other one you spoke about was the microbiome, I should say, is understanding the health of the microbiome for general intestinal and gastrointestinal health. And he said microplastics is a risk now that we're just beginning to understand the way that microplastics in the digestive system irritate that system and potentially trigger cancers. So it's understanding the extent of what that is doing, but as Kahu rightly pointed out, plastics come from petroleum, and to make crude oil into plastic requires dozens of different chemicals, many of which have their own toxicities, and they, as plastic breaks down into these other substances, smaller and smaller particles of different substances, it just is producing a whole lot of toxins that are going into the environment, going into the food chain, and we're at the top of the food chain. So it's definitely a big issue.
Thank you, Steve Kahu. Yes.
Where's the Green Party stand with this 3 waters, 10 waters, whatever it's going to be? And really, I don't even understand what the hell it's all about. And I guarantee that there's about 70% of New Zealanders don't know what it's all about. And I reckon if the Green Party had some visibility on the issue and explained what it was about, they may get another 50,000 votes, in my opinion.
Yeah, great question. And thank you for asking it, because I think you're right, there's just so much, no one knows what 3 waters and now 10 waters kind of is, although it's still about 3 waters. But in a nutshell, what it's about is, over the last 3 decades primarily, unfortunately, and this is since basically the current local government system that we've got now was set up, so this was late 80s, early 90s, there's been huge underinvestment in sort of the pipes and networks that actually deliver. So the 3 waters themselves are drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater. So those are the 3 waters that they refer to. You'd have no idea. You'd have no idea. I'm like in the freshwater world, and I still have to struggle to like think about which waters they are. Yeah, so drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater. And there's been huge underinvestment in that, and the numbers all vary, and everyone has different ideas about what the underinvestment has been, but it's roughly something between $120 to $180 billion of underinvestment. And the reason why is because we, sort of as the community, of course, have always been on at our politicians about not to raise rates. So we've said, don't raise rates or we won't vote you back in. So there we go, our politicians don't raise rates, and then we vote them back in. So, or they, send the investment to other areas of the community which they know will be good for their next election. So that's basically what's happened. And now the government have luckily, I think, actually decided to engage with the issue and say, we can't just let this keep going and going. You know, we've seen really big headlines around, for example, Wellington, where their networks are just falling apart. We need to actually take control and invest. And what's happened internationally is usually that means they aggregate the water services into more central entities, which have enough asset base that they can actually borrow the money to invest. So it's at the scale that's necessary to actually make an improvement. Now, there was a lot of different theories and pushback about how many entities should there be for, you know, little old New Zealand. And the government, when they first kind of raised it, they landed on, and this was in consultation with local government, I must say, they landed on 4 entities, but now recently the government said, due to a lot of pushback and opposition, they're going to do 10 entities to deliver this new sort of water services model. And that 10 entity model will be closer to their communities because it will be more based on the regions that we already have. So that's...
So the government's going to pay for all water supplies and improvements, and so the ratepayer won't pay for it. So
well, no, the ratepayer will pay for it. So the government is setting up the entities, but the idea is that we will pay less. So the general, again, numbers, like people have all these different numbers for it, but the general idea is that without these entities, communities would be paying in the realm of, like, depending where you are in New Zealand, $2,000 to $9,000 per year, which you can imagine would be like a big new burden, which we don't currently pay. But with the reforms, I think we'll be paying in the range of roughly 2,000 or something like that, and that's with the 10 entities. With the 4 entities, we were going to be paying about 1,000, but you know, these are just sort of numbers that get thrown around, and it depends where in New Zealand you are and what it actually means. Yeah, the other aspect, of course, which came into it, sorry, was, you know, and what people were upset about, and or some weren't upset, they were happy about it, but was this co-governance aspect, and there was a lot of sort of fear-mongering, I think, and misinformation about that, and it was basically the line of misinformation that was trying to be pushed was the idea that sort of Māori were taking over water, and that's simply not the case. What it actually alluded to was that the governance group for these new entities would be made up of 50% mana whenua. Now, this isn't even the actual board that governs the entities, it's literally the governance group that is, in theory, connected to the community and informs the board and sets a whole bunch of expectations to the board. So, yeah, but as you can imagine, there was a lot of fear-mongering around that and some pushback.
And racism.
And racism, unfortunately. Oh yeah, okay, sorry. So we are really getting on with time. Thank you so much for your patience in terms of this being your Sunday afternoon. Thank you so much to Kahu and Steve for your thoughts, and thank you so much to the organisers, particularly Rosemary and Quentin and Tim out there who have just done so well in bringing us together. I am now going to hand to Tim